and welcome back to Go Create Craft. It's been a while. So welcome to Darktable, which is what I'm using to export this lovely photo to PNG. So this is a raw camera image, just exported just because I like the shape of the car. Now, we don't need to worry about levels or anything like that. And I've moved into Affinity so that I can open a document that is the same size as my div area with my mat. I'm going to import photo. And I should say I've rotated the view so that when this photo comes in, it's around seemingly the wrong way, but it's the right way according to the actual document. And I'm going to rotate it round, and we can scale it as well and position it where on the mat we want to have it. So I'm treating my active area of my mat as the finished canvas frame, basically. So I can scale, reposition, and the edges of my mat is going to be the edges of my canvas. So that's just something to bear in mind when you're moving your image. I'm going to lock it because it's a template layer, and I'm going to lower the opacity. And you can do that as much or as little as you like. You want to still be able to see the definition of your outlines clearly, but it does help if it's not too strong. So I'm going to start off with a closed shape, so that's where we draw our 4 points, and we come back to our first point to close the shape. Now, we don't want to double cut a line, so this next shape is going to be an U, and it's going to finish back when it touches that first shape. So the whole idea of this process is I am creating masks. It's a very quick way of getting a background down onto your canvas ready for painting. So think of it as you're underpainting. So now we're going to work on the fence, barrier. So I've put a little upright in first because this mask is essentially going to be split into 2. And again, we've done that N shape down. We can then tweak that position as we need to. And if your fence isn't quite straight, we can add in a node and pull it down. So in terms of if you're working in Canvas Workspace, select that N shape so that you can see the nodes. Select your right-hand corner node, go to Add Node, and pop it in the middle, and then just drag that point to the top of the line. So the fence, we're going to break it down into rectangles. So you want to add your rectangles, and then you use the skew feature to actually get those rectangles where you need to. Now, you can do this on an individual basis, as I'm showing here, or you can do it as a set of 3. So if you are working in Canvas Workspace or anything else that doesn't have that ability to skew a shape, you're going to go into the node view, and you're going to select either both left-hand corners or both right-hand corners and drag or down to actually those to where you need them. Okay. So you want to spend a little time doing this, but not too much because we can tweak it as we go along. One thing to bear in mind with this video is I'm trying to show you this process as quickly as possible. So take your time. If you're working along with me, pause me. Otherwise, you may kind of feel a bit pushed. Now we're going to take those 3 boxes and we're going to duplicate them. And you can see I'm just doing that tweak while I'm zoomed in here. And there's 2 ways that we can duplicate. So we can use Control and J in most software, but not all. And you can press and hold Alt, click and drag a shape or group of shapes to actually create a really quick duplicate in nearly all software, including Canvas Workspace. So if you get used to using that one, you're going to find it actually that's probably going to be a go-to for this process. So the whole idea of using these basic shapes and that skew feature is to make something that's actually quite complex really quick and simple to do, because we have that repeating pattern. Okay, and we want to be looking for these repeats in our backgrounds so that we can speed up the process, yes, but also it makes our life simpler. And in terms of backgrounds, it's not going to be like that detail is what you want your viewer to focus on, which is really important to be thinking about while we're doing this masking process. Because once you've cut that mask, it is kind of set in stone. You don't really want to be having to recut it or having to tweak it, because then you have the risk of exposing areas a need for stencil. So we have this area of image that actually goes beyond our original photo. So I'm going to use that kind of same process, but I want to make sure that my shapes are staying within that active area. So you're going to see here that I'm bringing down that top line. And we want to try and make sure that our rectangles flow through. So if you think about the actual structure of a fence, you have your uprights and then your kind of horizontal wood pieces are actually hammered to those uprights. So they follow through past that post. So you want to make sure that your stencil does that same thing. Again, stop at the edge of the mat, and then we're going to use the pen tool to do all those kind of custom shapes. So in this case, I'm using my grid on my mat. So I've actually set up a grid in Affinity, and using that pen tool to kind of join the dots between those areas so that we don't have any areas like missed. Now, I'm keeping my fence really simple in terms of I want the fence in there. I'm not that bothered about the people sat behind it. If you want to do a really complex mask, kind of bringing in some kind of shape for those people that are sat in chairs, you can do. It really is up to you. But this for me isn't underpainting. It's going to be kind of how I get my kind of proportions right, so that I know that I am happy that my background fits the colour. Well, we can use this process not only for the background, but if you want to use it for the car as well, then you can do that to help you kind of paint it before we apply our other stencil. So this initial bit of design is all about masking rather than stenciling. Along here, and I'm going to do the top line of my fence. Now, like I said, I'm working with a grid, and also your smart guides are going to tell you where your posts kind of line up now, so that you can really simply and easily go from just finish that off. Now, everything else on that top fence line is actually beyond the edge of the mat. So you can see I'm kind of ignoring the extra. We're going to do a little line wherever we have somewhere that touches that mat that isn't going to cut along. So if you think about it as a kind of finishing edge to your frame, and then when you zoom out, you want to make sure that you have this black outline that goes all the way around. So over here, we've got that top corner. Nice easy one to finish off like so. And then we've got the little bars of our fence, which again, we can just join the dots with our pen tool. And when we're doing that, if you press P when you get to the end of your open line, and click off the line, then press P again to start the next one. That is the quickest way to cycle through. We're going to take all of those lines and we're going to group them using Control and Command and G, so that those lines that we can now say, that's our masking film, and that's going to make it easier when we get into Canvas Workspace or other cutter software. For now, we're going to hide that away as we're going to finish with that, and now we can concentrate on our stencil itself. So the stencil I want to use for details, and in this case, I'm going to create an outline. So I'm going to start by shaping a curve so that we can actually have it's pressure, but it's fake pressure that we can set in the machine rather than having to have a graphics tablet connected. Now, the reason that we do this is so that we're actually going to speed up this stenciling process. Now, if you're working in Canvas Workspace, what you're going to need to do is draw around this line. But the other benefit of doing it this way in Affinity or Illustrator with the line width tool is that we can actually have areas of that path that are going to have no, which means that we're not having to worry about building bridges, things for our stencils like we normally would. We can just concentrate on being artistic, and then I'll adjust that pressure so that there breaks in line naturally. Okay, so I've started with my first top curve here, and we can kind of change how that line's going to affect. So if I pull the pressure up to max, that's going to apply that pressure at full force of that line width. Okay, but then when I pull the centre bit down to 0, you're going to see you get these gaps, and it's the gaps that help us have a stencil that works. So it's really important that we make sure that we have no area that is isolated. Otherwise, when we come to peel away that stencil from our mat, it's not going to work. And this stencil could be cut from Mylar, it could be cut from wax card, it could be cut from stencil film. It really doesn't matter. It's whatever suits you and the medium that you're going to be creating that image with. Okay, so you saw there very briefly, it started to draw that same line again. That's when we use P button to go back to our arrow tool, click off, press P again to go back into the pen tool. So when we're cycling tool, that's a really kind of easy way of just not having to remember multiple tools. We can just go P to get back to our old tool and P again to get back to our pen tool. Okay. So again, we're keeping the same pressure with that break, because then we know it attaches. And this outline is very open to being, it's a suggestion of a sheet. So that when we come to actually do our painting, if we've done the masking, then great. Just hide this outline over the top and away we go. Or we might have gone into a bit more detail with our paint and then apply the outline. If you haven't done the masking, you can apply this outline first, do your painting, and then reapply the outline if you want to for your stylistic choices. So, in the same way with our masking where we can use basic shapes, we can also use basic shapes to help us when we're creating our outlines. Just as much as when we're actually creating with our pressures, we can do the same with our basic shapes so that they don't fall through. Next, let's talk about the tools that I'm using. So when I'm creating with the masks, where we're using these really simple and sometimes angular shapes, I'll use a trackpad or a mouse. Now, I actually prefer trackpad just for that ultimate accuracy when it comes to placing those points. But then as we start to lean into the brushstroke side of things like we are with this outline, I will switch to either using the mouse or a graphics tablet. So we can kind of get this swooping movement instead. Now, even if you're using a graphics tablet that has a lot of pressure levels, obviously, if we were to use the pen pressure to create those brush strokes, we're not going to have those areas of no pressure, because otherwise, how would the tablet know that you're drawing? So, we still want to be using that kind of faked pressure, using that pressure curve in Affinity. Or if we're working in Illustrator, we can use the line width tool and still keep using our graphics tablet to actually get the smoothness and the quality of line work without having to be worried at the same time about, am I pressing wide enough or hard enough to get width, as in the full width for that stroke? And there are bound to be similar tools in Inkscape and CorelDRAW. Okay? And when it comes to Canvas Workspace, what you're going to do essentially is be drawing around this line. So rather than drawing a nice, easy, straight, open path, you can actually be drawing the shape. And this is something you'll see as I start to get into the details a bit more, because we can do that with virtual line work too, is drawing around the side. I tend to do that once I've got the majority of my line work into place and I've done the conversion to curves process and welded it all together, as you'll see me do in a bit. So as I'm going through and drawing these lines, you're going to want to move that zero area around a bit. So you want those areas where you're keeping that stencil intact to almost be devoid of other information, because we don't want to be kind of losing out on those really critical areas of changes of direction or detailing that we might want to add. One of the things you'll see me do towards the end is actually going through and putting kind of inflections that hint at another detail that we probably can't put in a stencil. It's either too narrow or it's a change of colour, so we don't necessarily want to always outline it. Now, with your pressure, what you have to bear in mind is when it's at the top and it's at 100%, that widest point is still only going to be as wide as your stroke. So I'm using a stroke that is 5.5 points, but it all depends on the scale, the intricacy of what image you are creating a stencil of, as to how wide you want that line to be. So hence when I started this process, I did that little line, set the stroke, and kind of got a feel for how much of an outline I actually wanted to include. The joy of doing this from something like stencil film is it's going to hold that shape a lot better than if we were doing it from card. So we can actually get quite intricate in terms of that line width. But also bear in mind that what you're applying through that stencil is also going to have an effect on that stroke width. So if you are applying, say, paint with a sponge dauber, you're going to get almost like a little halo between where your stencil finishes and where that paint actually makes contact onto your surface. And obviously, the thicker your material is that you're using as a stencil, the bigger that halo is going to be. So if you're working with stencil film that has been voluntarily rubbed down to a surface and it's a smooth surface, you're going to get a minimal amount of halo. But if you're working with, let's say, with a thick mylar-based stencil, and maybe your canvas is text, you're going to have a much more noticeable halo. So when you're setting your stroke width, you kind of want to compensate for that and actually make your stroke width wider to allow for that halo to occur. Now, paths that we use to create our stencil don't have to necessarily be open paths. So you can see here that I've created that 7, but if I just create that stroke as a straight stroke, it's actually going to drop through our stencil, leaving that centre fill area of our 7 open, which is awkward one. So then we're going to also kind of add to that in of going down to that 0, but I'm also going to do it at the start or the finish. So you don't need to do it at both, but one or the other, so that the opposite side is also joined to the main film. And that's how you want to approach basic shapes as well. Make sure that there are 2 solid areas where you have no stroke. And even when we do our conversion to curves, you'll see that these no stroke areas do still translate through, so that we do need to remove them, but they're kind of a shape of their own, so they're nice and easy to get rid of. Now, you can also see where we have lines that meet other lines. I won't necessarily join it up to both sides of the line. So if you look to the left-hand side of the 7, you've got a diagonal that comes up to meet the 7 back half, but it stops before it gets to that 7, because otherwise we risk isolating a part of that stencil. And we want to make sure it stays joined. And we can do the same for lots of different areas of the car. So basically, if you can see an outline on your original photo, cut a stroke, because there's obviously enough of a definition in the original to make it worth putting an outline in the new one. Now, with your car, as I'm still going to be continuing on with the outline, let's talk a little bit about masking. Now, you've got these really bold areas of colour, and they're perfect for creating masking in the same way as we've done with our background. So you pick the middle kind of colour for your underpainting, so that actually what you're then doing is saving yourself some work, essentially, because all you've got to do is then blend your highlights and shading, job done, next area, and so on and so forth. And it just makes life so much quicker and easier for painting. Now, where you've got details that come over the top of those areas, so like, for instance, the logos on the car, what you can do is create a separate stencil or a separate masking, depending on how that shape works, so that you can then apply that at a later point. So in this case, the auto ident here, we could create that as almost a screen print stencil. So if we cut that from HTV, we can apply that onto a screen and then do that lovely process of screen printing it and getting it spot on. So don't be afraid to switch it up between the masking, the screen printing, and the stenciling. As you can probably tell, as I'm kind of getting back into things, I'm going to be concentrating on what I love to create with ScanNCut, but also what I love to create in general as an artist. I have a passion for image making, so hence I'm kind of showing you this process. But I also have some other processes for image making that we can do with our ScanNCut. I'm going to be showing you in the future. So do like and subscribe, It really just helps out. But also, you'll be the first to know when a new video or new premiere goes up. So if you're watching this with us as the premiere, hi, I'm in the comments. Just ask any questions. If there's anything that goes too fast, don't worry about it. You can come back and rewatch. One of the things I love about YouTube is I haven't got to faff about with downloading and re-uploading and all the rest of it. We get Facebook now. So you're going to see me much more on YouTube. So, again, just tweaking where that join occurs so that in this case, we put in that gap where we already have another line coming in so that we're not ending up with kind of too many areas where the stencil will be loose. And essentially, if you are using something like a pastel and you're trying to blend it through, it might catch. We don't want that, so the way to do that is to have that join into the line. Okay. So next time, I'm going to actually be looking at creating layered paper cuts as well. So you can see my process for those. And again, we've got closed shape, so we know we want it to either join in two places or join in one place has to be so strong that actually it's going to hold its own. So bring it down and add those 2 points at the start and finish. And we're going to continue working our way around. Now, I'm aiming to use a stencil film for this particular outline. So what you're going to find when you're cutting things like stencil film is that you want to read out your outline. It's going to feel really weird because you are essentially working the wrong way around to what you would normally be reading. If you think about reverse reading, it's that same technique. So it's going to be much more forgiving in terms of the spacing between individual elements, so long as you have those joints. Now, if you have like a stroke detail, you may not necessarily want to create it as an outline, but I would say is have some way of knowing that that's roughly the shape that it follows. So I haven't outlined the stripe, I've just done almost like a drop shadow, so that I know that above that outline is actually my stripe, that I can then go, okay, that goes down there, has 3 dots on the end, so on and so forth. Wheels, let's get this kind of notion of a spin. So I'm going to have 2 curves that are top left, bottom right. Then I'm going to duplicate that, rotate it so they go top right, bottom left, and scale it down for the next line in of the tire. If you think about it like that, in this rotating of that outline, you'll get wheels that actually feel more like they are spinning in motion. Whereas if you do them all on the same side, it's more like the wheels are stationary. So we're literally then looking at the car that is parked. And what we want to do when we're working with an image like this, where it's in motion, is we want to create as much of that energy that we can, even though we're working in something that's essentially static. So our lines could be as short as long as we need them. So don't be afraid to actually use shapes to create the details as well as using our lines. And you may find that between the front tire and the back tire, that actually the angle changes, so don't be afraid to tweak it. Car, particularly going around a corner, is not going to have two matching wheels, believe it or not. So don't be afraid to make that obvious. Likewise, the tires can be quite chunky, so if the image that you're working with, you can see that depth, outline that too. So, just work your way through the image, tweaking it as you need to. Pay attention to where your lines do join, because there will be some place where you want that line to kind of join up. But also make sure that you have enough separation that these things still work. So areas that I can see where I might want to go back and tweak are the stripes on the top part of the card. You can see that there's still a little bit too much of a line there. Could do a bit lighter or a bit simpler. So, once we have all our outlines in place, we're going to select all of our outline shapes so that they're all blue in our layers. We're going to expand the stroke. So, essentially what that means is it's then going to draw a path around the outside of those lines that we've now created. And then we can weld those together into one shape. Now, the benefit of doing this is that actually now we can start to actually tweak those lines with the pencil tool and the sculpt function. Now, if you are working in Illustrator, the pencil tool automatically works this way. You don't need to do anything else. If you are working in Affinity, make sure you tick the sculpt button at the top. Then, what we can see when we start to zoom in is actually, because we've applied pressure in a certain way, we're not necessarily getting nice neat caps here, there and everywhere. So we can use the pencil tool instead to tweak those caps so that they finish off nicely. So, for instance, here, it should be a nice semicircle, but it's actually not. I also want to join it anyway to this line. So we can use our stabilizer to help us achieve that smooth transition. So longer length stabilizer is going to give us a much more smooth line. A shorter length is better for if we want to see lots of detail or give like a fake edge. Longer the better in this one. And we're going to sort out those caps so that they round nicely or that they blend nicely. With the shapes in between, you're going to use the node tool, that's key press A, and you're just going to delete those items. So by tweaking that line, we can actually see where those separate shapes are and just delete. Now, the reason that we use the node tool, not the move tool, is we've welded all of our lines into one shape. So essentially they're one object. So if you're deleting the entire object, that is why you need to be using the node tool, not the move tool, or the select. And then we'll solve it. So again, we have another line here where we have a join, and you just want to bear in mind how that's working with the next shape. So here we can see in the background, actually, there's a shape to that background piece that we just haven't been able to put in the line work. So we can tweak it. So we're going to draw there. And then we've got the suggestion here of it going into another element. So we can actually put like a nothing on a racing car is 100% sharp. So we don't want our outlines to be either. So while it does a great job of rounding the outside of a corner in our outline, what it doesn't do is round the inside. So you can either use your corner rounder or we can just use the pencil tool to draw that curve in. Now you're going to notice that actually I'm not all about getting these curves perfectly how they were before. To me, using the pen tool to outline something is a really quick process for doing it, but it's not necessarily going to look the best in terms of maybe stenciling or outlining. So don't be afraid to put your handwork into the actual drawing. Don't think that vector artwork, because it is made up of these points and lines, has to be perfectly precisioned. And that's one of the joys of using a graphics tablet or something like Affinity or Illustrator or Commodore or even Adobe Studio. Because you are directly working with the shapes. So don't be afraid to. It's almost like the equivalent of handwriting. I know that there are a lot of people that don't like putting the handwriting in scrapbook papers, but it's important. It's you. So don't be afraid to put yourself in your work. So now what you want to do is just go through and you know how I was saying about these stripes being somewhat an issue. Then go back in, just get it how you want it. If you need to be a bit more of a divider line, then put it as a divider line. Just be aware of how that's connecting to your original maps. And again, where I said about adding in these hints and clues for details that we may not be able to put all of it in our stencil, I'm just doing like these little thin lines that are going to kind of join up and say, that's where that goes. And we can join up with our paint in between. Now, the reason that you saw that jump there is I do have Snap to Grid turned on. So sometimes it can try and be a bit clever. Just be aware of that. And just tweak it as you need to. Now, I do have auto close turned on, which is also quite important when we're doing these closed shapes, because we want these to lift out entirely of our stencil. Again, I could do this with 2 circles and subtract, but by putting it in there with a pencil tool, we're again putting ourselves and our handiwork back into our design. So I'm going to trace around the spokes and some of the other details of the tyres, so that we're kind of creating the negative. So bear in mind these will be applied at the same time as our outline, so they will be black if you're using black for your outlining. So try and stick to the darkest areas. Again, we don't want to complete that whole circle, otherwise the centre of the circle is going to fall out. So we'll do little sections of it instead. We can always then go back and join the dots, so to speak, if we need to. And we're going to draw around and join that back. So the beauty of the sculpt function is this ability to join back to our original line. And it's amazing how a few really weird shapes actually suddenly bring a lot more detail to your artwork. And then you can go in and recreate all those other intricacies in paint. It's there to give you the structure, and so the skeleton of your painting, that then you can put the muscles and the flesh onto. And then if you want to reapply that skeleton after, you can do, because you know it's going to match up perfectly because you've already put it on there once. And because we've still got the sculpt ticked, even though we're drawing new shapes, we don't have to do a particular function to be able to go and sculpt those shapes. We can just do it with that same tool and away we go. Now I'm going to leave the centre of the tyres devoid of a stencil. And that's because I want to keep that stencil reasonably strong. If we were to try and take the circle out, potentially we could end up actually weakening members of the film, which we don't want to do. So I'm doing a tiny little suggestion here of where this tire is going to come. But it's not about outlining the tire as such. Now, if you go past the origin point in Affinity, it will try and kind of close the shape in the wrong way. So try and do it either side of the origin point. You'll probably find that with one of those drawings, our origin point will move and then it gets smoother out left. So same here, I'm just adding a bit more finishing there. Making this line out because it's a little bit too bold as a highlight line. But I also want to put in enough suggestion here. And then I know that there's a change in colour there from where the light is hitting the object. And we can do that wherever we feel that we need to kind of create this almost like a fake shadow or a reference point. Something that's going to help us actually create that final image. Don't forget to also get rid of all the other little elements along the way where we put the pressure down to 0. So just quickly switch over to the note tool using the A key. And then we can go and press the N key to get back pencil. Now, those key presses are actually the same in the majority of software, the exception to that being Canvas. So it's a good one to try and get used to. A lot of the shortcuts you'll find within design software are actually transferable. Or, if you can't transfer it, you can change it. So if we go into on a Mac, for instance, if you go up to where you've got your software title, drop down, and you want to either have something that says settings or preferences, and you'll be able to go into shortcuts in there and alter the shortcut to what actually works for you. So when the contour tool came out in Affinity version 1 originally, it didn't have a shortcut, so I actually put that as an O. So it's quite funny that they did that in version 2. I'm sure it's just a little oversight, but it's worthwhile having those shortcuts working how you want them. And you can also, and it is shortcuttable, so do you want a word? You can also then get something like a Stream Deck or something like that, where you can basically set up your key presses. So, for example, a lot of graphics tablets have like function keys. Anything that has a function key that you can program, you can set that up for your tools. You can set it up for undo. Quite often have undo as one of my function keys on my graphics tablet. convert to curves is a good one to have as a function as well. That ability to just go, right, okay, set that in stone, and so off we go. Particularly to move into using warp and things like that. But if that's something you'd like me to cover in a bit more depth in terms of the actual hardware that I use, please let me know in the comments. If you're watching this on Premiere, I'll be live in the comments. If not, I will try and respond as quickly as possible. We are in the UK, and typically I do try to stick to normal working hours. But I'm playing a game of catch up at the moment, having been off for a while, so anyways, that's it. So I'm just adding in these little details that are just going to be nice and easy to transfer through. And I think that it's black. And you can always do a separate stencil for the highlights. So if you want to do a white only stencil, do that as a separate stencil and away you go. There is no limit to how many stencils you can use. And don't think that all stencils can only be black. It's a case of no. If you want to do layering stencils, if you want to use some of things, it's all the same process. It's just not being afraid to experiment. So yes, you hear that I'm putting suggestion at the bottom of the nose. I'm going to sort of this line here. I'm putting a suggestion in there. And again, don't forget to take out the little areas of zero pressure. So where you have something that's potentially really detailed, just bear in mind that as we're working zoomed in, it can be really easy for something that's a tiny detail to suddenly be looming really large. And you need to kind of overcompensate with a line width that isn't necessarily going to match or work with the rest of the shape. So zoom back out and check it when you're working on these things, and just bear it in mind. Sometimes you can find corners do weird things as well, so just tweaking that there so that we're getting a nice smooth. And you see again, if sometimes the origin is being a bit annoying, and sometimes you just have to go either side and hope that it changes. And the caps, I love that you can kind of join the dot. Or if you've already done like your base painting using your masking, you can use those points to line up so that you know that your stencil is in the right place. And where you go for your outlining. Now, we need to compress all of those loose shapes that we've now created above our stencil into that same stencil layer. So we're going to select all of them and we're going to weld them into that one shape. Now, what I meant to say before is if you're working in Illustrator or CorelDRAW, you may find that you can't weld because the two aren't overlapping. Instead, you can group and do it that way, or you can use a compound group or compound weld. And we can do this as many times as we need to. So if, as you're working through your project, you can see that actually you've missed a bit, then you can go back and continue drawing, and we can drop that weld each time. One of the things that does do is help save on memory. So if you're working on something that is particularly large, like I am, it's going to make your computer happier with you. So although vectors in and of themselves are actually quite low resources, if you're working over an image like we are here, that image itself still has a resolution and a memory that we need to consider. So now we're going to select everything one last time. We're going to weld it all together. We want to go in and just double check that nothing has changed with that welding process, because sometimes you can find that if, for instance, you created something where you've done like warp or quarter round or something, it may not necessarily weld how you think it's going to weld. So do go in and check. I'm checking for things like joints, trying to make sure there's nothing there that is going to cause me an issue. Okay. Or anything that I've missed. So I may just go and just add in a few different details. And again, if you're drawing any new shapes, then do repeat that process of welding. I'm going to draw in something to represent my stencil material. I'm going to colour it bright red so that we can see that actually stands out. And you want to size your stencil material to your design rather than to your canvas. That's going to help you save on materials. You can select both the stencil layer and your outline and use subtract, and then you have your stencil. Job done. Now, even at this point, if there was something that you thought needed tweaking, you can still tweak it. So, and be free to. Going to export. We're going to save it as an SVG. Now, if you have your preset set up, what you're going to do is just use that preset. If not, it's 96 dpi for ScanNCut, and then it's 90 for Cricut. Off the top of me. So Cricut and Silhouette, 90. Okay. So you can see how a ScanNCut set up. I have my stencil selected so that I can do selection only rather than the whole area. And that's it. That's as complicated as it gets. Give it a decent file name so that you know which is which. And we can send that to our machine, to our cutter software. It's really up to you. And we can do the same with our masking layer too. Unlock it, select it, and away you go. And again, because we've done that selection, it's going to be selection only, even though we're still going to that formed extent. And when we're taking that into our cutter software, just make sure that we have got a solid cut line around the outside. If not, just tweak that in your software using the pen tool, and job done. So, all that's left is to say thank you for joining me, and I hope you've enjoyed this whistle-stop tour of creating a stencil in Affinity or in Illustrator, Cold War, Canvas. It all works the same. Take care for now, and I hope to see you soon. Bye!